If anyone comes closer, I'll bite." The words weren't spoken aloud, but they were written in the eyes of the mother dog crouched behind the rusted dumpster at the edge of a small town in Indiana. Her ribs showed through her thinning fur. Her face was hollow with hunger, and yet she curled her fragile body protectively around the 3 tiny pups pressed against her belly. The ground beneath them was cold and hard, littered with broken glass and scraps of trash, but it was the only shelter she had found. The wind whipped down the empty alley, carrying the scent of fried food from a diner 2 streets away. The smell made her stomach twist painfully, but she did not move. She had not eaten properly in days, perhaps longer. Yet she would not leave her puppies. They whimpered weakly and nudged at her with tiny noses, searching for milk she no longer had the strength to provide. She licked each of their heads with tenderness that seemed impossible for an animal so starved and weak, her body trembling as she did so. On that cold afternoon, a man named Daniel walked by the alley with a paper bag of food from the diner. He was in his late 30s, with short brown hair and a worn denim jacket that carried the smell of coffee and sawdust from his workshop. Daniel wasn't looking for anything more than a quick way back to his truck parked around the corner, but something caught his attention. A sound. At first, he thought it was the squeak of a loose hinge or the chirp of a bird. Then he realized it was softer, more desperate. A cry. He paused and turned toward the alley, peering into the shadows. That's when he saw her. The mother dog lifted her head, lips curling back to reveal her teeth. Her eyes locked on him, fierce and shining, though her body was so thin he could see the bones along her spine. He froze, his heart aching at the sight. Behind her, he spotted the movement of the puppies, tiny, fragile bodies squirming against her. Daniel crouched down slowly, keeping a safe distance. "Hey there," he said softly, his voice carrying a gentleness he hoped she would understand. He set the paper bag down on the cracked pavement in front of him and opened it carefully, pulling out a piece of the sandwich he had ordered. The smell of warm bread and chicken drifted through the air. The mother dog stiffened, her ears twitching, but she didn't move. Daniel tore off a small piece and placed it on the ground before sliding it closer. The dog's eyes flicked to the food, then back to him. She growled low, a warning, but her pups squirmed restlessly at her side. Hunger battled fear in her eyes. Daniel waited, not making another move. After several tense minutes, the mother dog crept forward a few inches, her body shaking with weakness. She sniffed the piece of food cautiously before snapping it up and retreating quickly to her pups. She chewed slowly, almost as if she didn't believe what she was eating was real. Then she looked back at Daniel. He could see her ribs rise and fall rapidly with every breath, and he knew she was on the edge of collapse. He gently pushed another piece toward her. Again, she darted forward and snatched it. Each bite seemed to give her a spark of strength, though her eyes never left him. Daniel placed the rest of the sandwich in front of her, then slowly rose to his feet. "It's all yours," he said quietly, backing away. The mother dog ate in hurried bites, pausing every few moments to glance back at her pups. She nudged them closer to her belly, as though reminding them she was still there. Daniel watched from a distance, torn between relief that she had eaten something and worry that it wasn't nearly enough. The sight of those small, trembling puppies pressed against her nearly broke him. He wanted to scoop them all up and carry them to safety, but he knew trust wouldn't come that easily. Not today. Over the next few days, Daniel returned to the alley with food. Sometimes it was leftover chicken from the diner, Other times it was cans of dog food he bought at the store. Each time the mother dog met him with the same fierce stare, her growl low and steady, her body still planted between him and her pups. Yet slowly, something changed. The growls became softer, her movements less frantic. She began to eat without waiting for him to walk away completely. One evening, as the sun set in a wash of orange and pink, Daniel placed a small bowl of water on the ground. The mother dog approached cautiously and drank deeply, her body quivering with gratitude she didn't know how to show. Still, she would not let him near the puppies. Whenever he tried to take a step closer, she bared her teeth. Daniel respected her boundaries, even though it pained him to see the puppies shiver in the cold. He started leaving blankets folded near the dumpster, and one morning he found that she had dragged one closer to her little family, making a small nest out of it. Seeing them curled together on the blanket filled him with hope. Daniel began to talk to her whenever he visited. "You're a good mama," he would say, his voice calm and steady. "You're doing your best." He told her stories about his childhood dog, about the workshop he ran on the edge of town, about the small house that often felt too quiet since his wife had passed a few years earlier. He didn't know if she understood the words, but she seemed to respond to the tone. Her eyes softened slightly when he spoke, though her body remained tense. The days turned into a week. The puppies grew a little stronger, their cries louder now. They wriggled and climbed over each other, their tiny paws pushing against their mother's side. She licked them tenderly, exhaustion pulling at her, but love driving her forward. Daniel knew that if he didn't act soon, the harsh winter nights could steal the fragile progress they had made. He spent hours debating how to help without shattering the fragile trust he had built. Then one afternoon, as a light snow began to fall, Daniel walked into the alley carrying a large carrier lined with blankets. The mother dog tensed immediately, her body rigid with suspicion. He set the carrier down a few feet away and sat beside it, speaking softly. "I can't leave you here much longer," he murmured. "You deserve warmth, and they deserve safety." He left food, as he always did, but this time he also nudged the carrier slightly closer, letting her see it was nothing dangerous. She sniffed the air, ears flicking uncertainly. The puppies yawned and curled tighter against her. That night, Daniel lay awake in bed, the image of the little family in the cold alley haunting him. He rose before dawn, filled a thermos with warm broth, and drove back. The snow had coated the alley in white, and he saw her curled tightly around her pups, her fur dusted with frost. He knelt beside the carrier once more, this time opening the door wide. "It's safe," he whispered, his breath clouding in the cold air. He placed the thermos lid on the ground, filled with the steaming broth. The mother dog's nose twitched, and after a long hesitation, she drank. Her eyes met his as though weighing a choice too great to make. The first chapter of their story was still unfolding. Trust was fragile, built from small acts of kindness and moments of understanding. For now, the mother dog still stood guard, her eyes sharp and protective, her body curled around her tiny pups. But a seed had been planted. A stranger had done something she never expected. He had chosen patience, compassion, and hope. And in that snowy alley, something had begun to change. The cold morning air stung Daniel's cheeks as he walked down the familiar alley once again, clutching a bag filled with food and supplies. The mother dog was still there, curled protectively around her pups, their tiny bodies pressed close to her chest. She raised her head when she saw him, her tired eyes wary but less wild than before. Her growl was faint, almost out of habit rather than true threat. Daniel crouched a short distance away and spoke softly. "Morning, sweetheart. I brought breakfast." He laid out pieces of chicken, some rice, and poured fresh water into the bowl he had been bringing each day. The smell carried quickly in the crisp air, and the mother dog's nose twitched. She shifted slightly, licking one of her puppies before slowly moving toward the food. Her steps were unsteady, her legs thin and trembling, but she reached the plate and began to eat. She chewed quickly, glancing back at her pups every few seconds, making sure they were still safe. Daniel stayed perfectly still, watching. Each day he saw more of her true spirit beneath the hunger and fear. She was fiercely devoted, never taking more than a few bites before turning back to nuzzle her puppies. It made him think of his wife, Emily, who used to fuss over everyone at the dinner table, making sure others ate before herself. That memory pinched at his chest, but also warmed him. He knew that kind of love was rare, and here it was before him again, in the shape of a weary, stray dog. After she finished the food, Daniel pushed the carrier a little closer. The dog stiffened, her body tense, and Daniel stopped immediately. "Easy," he said gently. "Not today. Just getting you used to it." He backed away again and sat on an overturned crate, his hands resting loosely on his knees. He stayed there for nearly an hour, just talking in his calm tone. He told her about the workshop projects he needed to finish, about the leaky roof on his porch, about the neighbor who always shoveled his sidewalk before he could. She didn't understand the words, but she heard the rhythm, the kindness behind them. Her ears flicked toward him now and then, but she kept her body curled protectively around her little ones. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the air as the morning stretched on. Daniel finally stood and left the alley, his heart heavy with the knowledge that he couldn't keep coming forever. The winter storms would grow harsher. One night could be too much for her frail body and those tiny pups. He needed a plan, but he also needed her trust. He decided to take things slowly, one small step at a time. The next day, he returned with something new. Instead of just food, he carried an old quilt that had belonged to Emily. It was faded but soft, stitched with patterns of little stars. Daniel hesitated as he laid it down a few feet from the family. The mother dog eyed it suspiciously, sniffing the air. He gently slid it closer to the spot where she lay. At first, she ignored it. But later, as Daniel sat watching quietly, she stretched her paw toward the edge of the quilt and pulled it closer. By the following morning, she had dragged it fully beneath her pups, creating a warmer nest. Daniel smiled when he saw them curled on the quilt. "Good girl," he whispered, his voice catching. As the days rolled into another week, the puppies began to change. Their eyes opened, revealing cloudy blue gazes that blinked uncertainly at the world. They yawned and squeaked, their tiny paws batting at each other clumsily. Daniel's heart swelled each time he saw them growing stronger. He noticed one pup had a white patch shaped like a heart on its chest, while another had a darker coat with floppy ears that stuck out adorably. The smallest one was shy, always pressed closest to their mother's belly, peeking out timidly. Each of them was fighting to live, and Daniel knew they wouldn't have come this far without her. One afternoon, he dared to inch a little closer. He stretched out his hand slowly, palm open, and rested it on the ground. The mother dog stiffened, her lips curling slightly, but she didn't lunge. She held his gaze for a long moment, then lowered her head to lick one of her pups. That tiny gesture, a choice to care for her babies instead of driving him away, told Daniel more than words ever could. She was starting to trust him, if only a fraction. That night, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, staring at the old photo albums stacked in front of him. Emily's smile looked back at him from the pictures, her arms wrapped around their golden retriever, Max, who had passed years ago. He closed the album and sighed. His house had been silent for so long. The idea of filling it again, even with the sound of puppy paws skittering across the floor, made his chest feel lighter. But he wasn't there yet. First, he had to bring them in safely. The following morning, Daniel drove to the local animal clinic and spoke to Dr. Miller, an older veterinarian he trusted. He explained the situation: the starving mother dog, the puppies, the alley. Dr. Miller listened carefully, nodding. "You've done good so far," the vet said. "But you're right, they can't stay out there. The cold alone could do them in. If you can get them into that carrier, I'll check them right away." Daniel nodded, determination firm in his chest. "I'll earn her trust. I'll get them to you." Back in the alley, Daniel set the carrier down once again. This time he opened the door wide and placed food just inside. The mother dog tilted her head, her ears twitching. She sniffed the air and edged forward, but stopped just short of the opening. She barked once, sharp and low, then retreated back to her pups. Daniel sighed softly, not discouraged, but aware it would take more time. Each day he repeated the process, leaving food closer to the carrier. She grew braver bit by bit, sniffing around it, pawing the edges, but never stepping inside. The puppies, meanwhile, grew more curious. One bold little pup waddled clumsily toward the door one afternoon, nose twitching. The mother quickly nudged it back with her muzzle, her protective instinct stronger than curiosity. Daniel chuckled quietly, the sound echoing softly in the alley. "Not yet, huh? We'll get there." It was during one of these afternoons that a passerby noticed Daniel crouched in the alley. A woman named Karen, who lived a few blocks away, stopped and asked, "What are you doing there?" Daniel explained, pointing to the mother dog and her pups. Karen's eyes softened as she saw them huddled on the quilt. "They're beautiful," she whispered. "If you need help, let me know. I volunteer at the shelter sometimes." Daniel thanked her, though he knew the mother dog wasn't ready for more strangers. Still, it comforted him to know others cared too. For now, it was just between him and her. Trust was fragile, like a thread that could snap with one wrong move. But each day he saw progress. She no longer growled at his every step. Her eyes, once filled with suspicion, now held something else: hesitation, but also the faintest spark of hope. One particularly cold evening, Daniel decided to take a leap. He warmed some chicken broth and brought it in a small bowl, placing it just inside the carrier. The scent drifted out, rich and inviting. The mother dog sniffed the air and whined softly, torn between fear and need. The puppies stirred, squeaking, and she looked down at them before back at the bowl. Slowly, painfully slowly, she rose to her feet and stepped forward. Daniel's breath caught as she moved closer, her paws just at the edge of the carrier. She stretched her neck forward, lapped at the broth, and then, just for a second, stepped one paw inside. Daniel's heart soared. It wasn't everything, but it was a step, the kind of step that meant everything. He didn't move, didn't breathe, afraid to break the moment. After a few sips, she backed out again, curling around her pups once more. But Daniel knew what he had seen. She was considering it. That night, he drove home with a smile on his face for the first time in weeks. The stars were bright over the quiet town, and he felt a spark of something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. Tomorrow, he promised himself, he would try again. And maybe, just maybe, she would take another step. The story of the starving mother dog and her puppies was far from over. It was only just beginning, and Daniel was ready to see it through. Daniel's breath clouded in front of him as he entered the alley once more, the crunch of ice beneath his boots sharp in the silence of early morning. The sky was painted in muted grays, the kind of light that promised another snowstorm would soon arrive. He carried a heavier bag this time, filled with food, water, and even a soft toy he had bought on a whim, wondering if the puppies might take comfort in something to cuddle besides their mother. As he turned the familiar corner, the sight met him again. The mother dog with her head raised, eyes locking onto him immediately, her body curled tightly around the pups as though bracing herself. She no longer growled as she once did, but she didn't move either. Daniel spoke gently, the sound of his voice breaking the icy stillness. "I'm back, sweetheart. I've got something for you." He crouched low and opened the bag, letting the smell of warm chicken and rice fill the air. The mother's nose twitched, and she shifted slightly, her ribs visible beneath her fur, but her strength had returned just enough to allow her to rise carefully to her feet. Daniel placed the food down and backed away slowly. She approached with hesitation, pausing every few steps to glance back at her pups. Her instincts were so strong, so unwavering, that Daniel found himself whispering encouragement just as he might have done to a frightened child. "It's all right. They're safe." She reached the plate and ate, her movements quick and purposeful, each bite restoring some measure of her spirit. Meanwhile, one of the bolder pups, the one with the heart-shaped patch of white on its chest, wobbled forward. Daniel's lips curved into a smile as the puppy sniffed at his boot before tumbling back into the safety of its mother's tone. It was the closest contact he'd had yet, and his heart swelled with quiet victory. For the next several days, the pattern repeated. Each time he came, the mother allowed herself a little more freedom, stepping closer to him, sniffing the toy he had left, dragging the quilt further into their corner. The pups began to grow restless, their little legs gaining strength, and they often clambered over each other in fits of squeaky determination. Daniel started to notice their personalities emerging. The one with the heart-shaped patch was bold, curious, always the first to explore. The darker pup with floppy ears tended to bark in tiny, high-pitched bursts as if declaring itself to the world. The smallest one remained shy but showed signs of hidden courage, venturing out only when the others paved the way. One afternoon, as a bitter wind whistled through the alley, Daniel knew the time had come to push forward. He brought the carrier again, this time placing it closer than ever before, the door propped wide open with a blanket inside. He laid food just at the threshold, then a trail leading further in. The mother dog stiffened, her eyes flicking between the carrier and Daniel. He sat still, keeping his voice low and soothing. "This is the way out. Warmth, safety. No more nights in the cold." She hesitated for long minutes, every muscle in her body taut with conflict. Finally, hunger drove her forward, one paw at a time. She stretched her neck inside, licked up the food, then darted back. Daniel didn't move, though his chest raced with hope. The seed of trust had grown another inch. That evening, as the storm began to roll in, Daniel found himself sitting at his workbench, unable to focus on the shelves he was supposed to build for a customer. His mind kept drifting to the alley, to the pups shivering in the cold. He pictured their mother dragging the quilt tighter, her body straining to keep them warm. The thought made him restless. Finally, he stood, grabbed his coat, and drove back despite the swirling snow. The alley was nearly buried in white, but he could see them still, their nest of blankets a small island in the storm. The mother dog lifted her head when he appeared, her eyes tired but steady. He knelt beside the carrier, this time holding the thermos of broth again. Steam rose into the air, carrying the scent that made her whine softly. She moved closer, her paws pressing into the snow. Daniel lowered the bowl to the ground inside the carrier. For the first time, she stepped fully in, just long enough to drink deeply, then backed out again with haste. Daniel didn't follow, didn't try to close the door, though every part of him wanted to. Instead, he smiled through the cold. "Good girl, we're getting there." As the storm worsened, Daniel spent much of the night awake, checking the window for signs of calm. When morning finally came, he was exhausted but determined. He returned with another quilt, thicker than the last, and found that she had managed to keep the pups alive through the night. He laid the quilt beside their spot and stepped back. After a long moment, she dragged it toward her babies, circling them with warmth. Daniel's eyes stung as he watched. Her determination was stronger than any storm, but even that would not be enough forever. She needed a real home. By the second week, the puppies had grown stronger still, their squeaks turning into playful yips. They explored the quilt, tugged at the toy Daniel had brought, and wrestled each other clumsily. Their mother watched with cautious pride, her eyes never straying far. Daniel began to imagine what it would be like when they were safe inside his house, running across wooden floors, tumbling after each other, their mother finally able to rest without fear. That vision drove him forward. He placed food deeper into the carrier each day, and each day she ventured further in. The pups began to toddle closer too, their curiosity growing. Daniel remained patient, his voice always gentle. "Soon, sweetheart. You'll see. It's better than this." But the world wasn't always patient. One afternoon, Daniel arrived to find a group of teenagers throwing snowballs at the far end of the alley. They scattered when they saw him, but the damage was done. The mother dog was shaking, her eyes wild again. Her pups pressed deep into the quilt. Daniel's chest tightened with anger, but he forced his voice to remain calm as he crouched down. "They're gone. You're safe now." It took a long while before she stopped trembling, but she did, and she even edged toward the food he had brought. Daniel's resolve only deepened. He couldn't let another scare happen. He had to bring them home soon. That night, Daniel spoke to Dr. Miller on the phone, explaining the progress. The vet encouraged him. "You're close. Once she's inside, close the door gently. She'll panic, but she'll calm once she realizes her pups are with her. Then bring them straight here." Daniel nodded, though no one could see him. He knew it would be the hardest step yet. Trust was fragile, and breaking it could undo everything. But he also knew there was no other way forward. The next morning, Daniel packed the carrier with fresh blankets and food, set it down in the alley, and sat quietly nearby. The snow had stopped, and sunlight glistened on the drifts. The pups toddled toward the entrance, their little tails wagging uncertainly. Their mother watched, torn between holding them back and letting them explore. Finally, she stood, nudged them forward, and followed close behind. The sight of them edging closer to safety filled Daniel's chest with warmth. He whispered softly, more to himself than to her, "Almost there. Just a little more, and you'll never be cold again." For now, the alley remained their world. But with each small step, Daniel knew they were moving towards something greater. The bond between them was still fragile, a bridge built from food, blankets, and patience, yet it held. And as he watched the mother dog sniff the carrier once again, her eyes no longer filled with only fear but also a hint of trust, he felt a surge of certainty. The day was coming when she would step fully inside with her pups, and when she did, everything would change. The early morning frost clung to the rooftops as Daniel walked through the quiet streets, carrying another bag of supplies. He had grown accustomed to this routine, rising before the sun, making his way down to the alley, and sitting in the cold for hours, if that was what it took. When he reached the familiar corner, he saw her there as always, the mother dog curled tightly around her 3 puppies. Her eyes caught his movement immediately, watching as he crouched down, set the bag aside, and greeted her in that same calm voice. "Morning, sweetheart. How are the babies today?" The puppies were more active now, their little legs stronger each day. The bold one with the white patch on its chest stumbled out first, sniffing the cold air before tumbling forward with enthusiasm. The darker pup with floppy ears was right behind, yipping in a high-pitched bark, as if to announce its arrival. The smallest one lagged, clinging close to their mother, yet eventually peeking out from the blanket nest. Daniel's heart swelled with pride and worry all at once. They were thriving, but he knew the alley would never be enough to sustain them much longer. The mother's eyes were less wild now, softer somehow, though still cautious. She watched closely as Daniel placed the food inside the carrier, creating a path leading deep into it. She hesitated, as always, but this time her nose twitched harder, the smell pulling her forward. Daniel stayed perfectly still, his voice low and encouraging. "You can do it. Just a few more steps." She leaned forward, her paw lifting uncertainly. Then she backed away again, curling protectively around her pups. Daniel didn't show disappointment, though his chest ached with how close they were. Instead, he smiled softly and left the food there, rising to his feet. He sat on the crate nearby, pulling his coat tighter as the wind swept down the alley. The mother dog sniffed at the carrier once more, then carefully flopped her inside far enough to eat. His heart leapt, but he didn't rush to close the door. It wasn't time yet. He needed her to choose it fully, to trust him enough that it wouldn't shatter when he made that final move. Over the next few days, he returned again and again. Each time the mother dog ventured further inside the carrier, her paws scraping the blanket, her head ducked low as she ate. The puppies grew braver too, toddling toward the entrance, their tails wagging in uneven rhythms. Daniel began leaving the toy inside the carrier, and soon the pups dragged it around, chewing on the corners and tumbling over it in play. Watching them discover joy, despite the harshness of their surroundings, gave Daniel hope. Still, every evening he went home restless, replaying the same questions. Would she let him take them soon? Would she panic and undo everything they had built? One evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, Karen appeared at the end of the alley again. She carried a bag from the shelter, and inside it were small collars and a couple of cans of food. She approached slowly, asking, "Any progress?" Daniel nodded, glancing at the family nestled in the quilt. "Some. She's going inside the carrier now, but only for food. Not long enough yet." Karen crouched down, her breath fogging in the air. "She trusts you more than anyone. That's rare. Most strays wouldn't let you this close with pups involved." Daniel gave a faint smile. "I know. That's why I can't mess this up. One wrong move and we're back at the beginning." Karen placed a hand on his arm briefly, a gesture of reassurance before standing again. "Call me if you need backup. The shelter will take them if you can't keep them." Daniel didn't answer right away, his gaze lingering on the dogs. Finally, he whispered, "I think I already made up my mind." The following morning brought another storm. Snowflakes whirled down from the gray sky, piling against the dumpsters and coating the ground in icy layers. Daniel trudged through the wind with determination, his arms full of blankets and a thermos of broth. The alley looked nearly buried, but there they were, huddled together. Their mother lifted her head, her fur dusted and white, her eyes tired but alert. Daniel knelt quickly, brushing the snow aside to place down the carrier with extra blankets inside. He poured the steaming broth into a shallow bowl, the scent drifting into the cold air. She whined softly, rising to her feet. Her pups squeaked and tumbled, nudging against her as she moved forward. This time, Daniel noticed something different in her posture. She stepped into the carrier without hesitation, lapping at the broth with urgency. Her body filled the small space, and the pups, curious, toddled after her. For a brief moment, all four were inside. Daniel's heart raced as he realized how close they were to safety. He didn't close the door. Not yet. His hands trembled with restraint, but he knew this wasn't the moment. If he slammed it shut now, she might never trust him again. Instead, he simply watched, his breath catching at the sight. The family remained inside for nearly a full minute before the mother backed out, guiding her pups with her. But Daniel knew. He knew they were ready. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would do what he had been waiting for since the first day he stumbled upon them. Tomorrow, he would bring them home. That night, sleep barely touched him. He lay awake, imagining every possible outcome. What if she panicked too much? What if the pups got hurt in the chaos? What if, despite everything, she still didn't trust him enough to stay? But another image returned again and again. The mother curled up on Emily's quilt, her pups nestled close, their tiny bodies safe in the warmth of his home. That vision outweighed all fear. By dawn, Daniel knew he would try. He owed it to them and to himself. When he arrived in the alley that morning, the sky was clear for the first time in days, the world glittering with fresh snow. The mother dog rose when she saw him, her eyes softer than ever, her body no longer trembling with constant fear. Daniel set down the carrier, filled it with food, and whispered, "This is it, sweetheart. This is your new life." She approached, sniffed the air, and stepped inside with her pups following closely. Daniel's heart pounded as he reached for the door. His fingers trembled, but his voice stayed calm. "Good girl. You're safe now." Then, with one careful motion, he closed the door. The sound was soft but final. The mother stiffened instantly, her eyes flashing with panic. She turned, pressing against the door, her pups squeaking in confusion. Daniel crouched low, speaking quickly. "Shh, shh. It's okay. I'm right here. You're not losing them. You're safe. I promise." For long moments, the air was filled with the sound of her frantic breathing. Then, slowly, her body lowered. She curled around her pups inside the carrier, her eyes still on Daniel. He reached his hand against the side of the carrier, palm flat against the cold plastic. "I've got you. We're going home." As he lifted the carrier and began walking out of the alley, Daniel's heart felt heavier and lighter all at once. The chapter of the alley was closing, but another one had begun. The family was finally leaving the cold behind, stepping toward a new world they had never imagined possible. The carrier felt heavier than Daniel had expected as he lifted it from the icy ground, though it wasn't the weight of the mother dog and her pups that pressed against his arms. It was the significance of the moment. For weeks he had fed them, waited with them, spoken to them softly in the alley, and now, for the first time, they were contained within the safety of a carrier. Their future was no longer tied to the biting winds and the bitter cold of an alley corner. As he walked toward his truck, the mother dog shifted uneasily inside, her eyes fixed on him, wide and wary. Her pups squeaked, crawling over each other, their tiny cries filling the carrier. Daniel spoke in low tones, steady and calm. "You're all right. I've got you now." His truck was parked just down the street, the bed lined with another thick quilt he had laid out the night before in anticipation. Daniel placed the carrier inside carefully, tucking an extra blanket over it to shield the family from the worst of the wind. He climbed into the driver's seat, heart pounding, and started the engine. The rumble startled the mother dog, her ears flattening, her body pressed protectively over her pups. Daniel glanced into the rearview mirror, catching the flicker of her eyes through the carrier. "Just a short ride," he murmured. Then warmth, food, and no more snow. The drive felt longer than it was. Every stop sign, every turn of the wheel carried the sound of the puppy's cries, the mother's quiet whine. Daniel kept speaking, hoping his voice might soothe her. Finally, he pulled into his driveway, the sight of his small house waiting like a beacon. It had been quiet for so long, empty of laughter, of paws scurrying across the floor. But today, it would come alive again. He carried the carrier inside, the warmth of the house wrapping around him instantly. He set it down in the living room, on the rug in front of the fireplace, which he had stoked earlier so that the heat filled the air with comforting warmth. Slowly, carefully, Daniel opened the carrier door. The mother dog didn't move at first, her body tense, her eyes scanning every corner of the unfamiliar space. The pups, however, were more curious. The bold one with the white patch stumbled forward first, tumbling out onto the rug. Its little legs wobbled, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air. The floppy-eared pup followed quickly, yipping with excitement, stumbling toward the warmth of the fire. The smallest one lingered, looking back at its mother before cautiously stepping out. Their mother finally rose, her body shaking as she exited the carrier, her gaze locked on Daniel. She didn't growl, but every line of her body screamed of vigilance. Daniel stayed where he was, sitting on the couch, his hands folded loosely. "This is your home now," he said softly. "No more alleys, no more cold." The puppies stumbled around, their tiny tails wagging as they explored. They nipped at the edge of the blanket, tumbled into each other, barked their squeaky little barks at shadows on the wall. Their mother followed close, circling them. keeping them always within reach. She sniffed the rug, the couch, the corners of the room, each movement cautious. When her eyes returned to Daniel, he offered her a bowl of warm food he had prepared earlier. She hesitated, then stepped forward, her nose twitching at the smell. Slowly, she ate, each bite restoring her weary body. Daniel felt something stir in his chest as he watched, something he hadn't felt in years. The room, once so empty, now pulsed with life. Over the next hour, the mother dog began to relax ever so slightly. She lay on the rug with her pups nestled against her, the fire's warmth washing over them. Daniel sat nearby, speaking softly, letting her grow accustomed to his presence in this new space. At one point, the bold puppy clambered toward his boot and began chewing on the laces. Daniel chuckled, leaning down to gently untangle the tiny mouth. The mother tensed, but didn't stop him. That small allowance, that flicker of trust, made Daniel's chest swell with gratitude. As night fell, he prepared a space in the corner of the living room, laying out more quilts and blankets to form a soft bed. He guided the little family there, speaking gently as he moved them. The mother circled the bed, sniffing every edge, then lay down with her pups curling close. Daniel sat nearby until her eyes began to close, exhaustion pulling her into sleep. For the first time in weeks, she was warm, her puppies safe beside her, the storm outside muffled by walls and windows. Daniel watched them for a long time, his own eyes heavy, before finally retreating to his bedroom. But even then, the sound of their tiny breaths reached him down the hall, filling his house with a comfort he hadn't known he needed. The next morning, Daniel woke earlier than usual, drawn by the faint whines coming from the living room. He walked in to find the pups awake, clambering over each other, their little tails wagging furiously. Their mother lifted her head, watching him with the same caution as always, though her eyes were softer now, less sharp with fear. Daniel prepared their breakfast, placing food for her and a shallow dish of softened kibble for the pups. They sniffed it uncertainly at first, but soon began nibbling, their tiny teeth crunching clumsily. Their mother ate slowly, her eyes still on Daniel, but she didn't stop him from being close. Over the days that followed, the house began to transform. Toys appeared in the living room, chew bones on the rug, paw prints on the wooden floor. The puppies grew bolder, exploring every corner, climbing onto the couch, barking at their reflections in the glass door. The mother dog remained protective but began to ease, watching as Daniel knelt down to play gently with the pups. Sometimes she even sat a few feet away, her head tilted, as though trying to understand this man who had changed their lives. Daniel took them to Dr. Miller, loading the carrier into his truck once again, though this time the ride was calmer. The puppies yipped and tumbled, and their mother whined softly but didn't panic. At the clinic, Dr. Miller examined each pup carefully, checking their weight, their tiny teeth, their hearts. He pronounced them healthy, though small. Then he examined their mother. She was malnourished, weak, but with food and care she would recover. "You saved them just in time," Dr. Miller told Daniel, his eyes kind. "Another week out there, and it might have been too late." Daniel swallowed hard, looking down at the mother dog curled protectively around her pups. "She saved them," he said softly. "I just helped." Back at home, Daniel sat on the couch, watching the little family play in the living room. His heart felt lighter than it had in years. The silence that had once weighed so heavily on the house was gone, replaced with the sound of tiny paws, yips, and the gentle sighs of a mother who could finally rest. The journey was far from over. Trust still had to be earned fully, and the pups still had to grow. But for the first time, Daniel believed with all his heart that they were on their way to something beautiful. The first week inside Daniel's home felt like a dream, though not without challenges. The puppies quickly turned the living room into their playground, their tiny paws slipping across the wooden floor, their high-pitched barks echoing against the walls. They chased each other in endless circles, nipping at tails, clambering over blankets, and collapsing into small, snoring heaps when exhaustion caught up with them. Their mother followed closely, keeping a watchful eye, circling them with quiet vigilance. At night, she curled around them in the bed Daniel had made from quilts and blankets, her eyes flicking toward him whenever he passed. She still wasn't ready to relax completely, but the sharp fear in her gaze had dulled to something gentler, something more uncertain than hostile. Daniel adjusted quickly to the chaos. He stocked his cupboards with kibble, cans of food, puppy pads, and chew toys. He found himself waking earlier, his mornings filled with feeding them, cleaning up after them, and sitting cross-legged on the floor while the puppies climbed all over him with boundless energy. The bold one with the white patch always led the charge, tugging at his sleeves and clambering into his lap as if claiming him. The floppy-eared pup barked at everything from shadows to shoelaces, demanding attention. The smallest one, cautious but sweet, often curled against his side, its tiny body trembling at first until it grew used to his warmth. Each of them carved out a place in his heart faster than he thought possible. The mother dog remained cautious. She ate the food he set down, accepted the warmth of the fire, and watched her pups explore. But she kept her distance from Daniel. Sometimes she allowed him to sit close, her eyes meeting his without growling. But other times she would stiffen if he moved too quickly. He understood, never pushing her beyond what she could handle. "You've done enough," he often told her quietly, watching as she licked her pups tenderly. "You kept them alive. Now it's my turn to help." On the second week, Daniel took them all back to Dr. Miller for a follow-up visit. The puppies were stronger already, their coats shinier, their bellies round with food. They squirmed on the exam table, yipping as the vet checked their ears and weighed them. Dr. Miller smiled. "They're thriving. You're doing good work, Daniel." Then he turned to the mother dog. She stood rigid on the table, her eyes darting, but she didn't fight. The vet examined her ribs, checked her teeth, and listened to her heartbeat. "She's been through a lot, but she'll recover well here. Keep feeding her, keep her warm, and give her time." Daniel nodded. Glancing at her, she pressed her nose against her pups once more. When they returned home, Daniel decided to name the pups. He had avoided it before, uncertain if he should, but watching them grow day after day made it impossible not to. He called the bold one with the white patch Scout, the floppy-eared troublemaker Rascal, and the smallest, shyest one Daisy. The names felt right, fitting their personalities perfectly. As for their mother, he hadn't chosen yet. It felt different, as though her name had to mean something more. For now, he simply called her Mama when he spoke to her. As days turned into weeks, the bond between Daniel and the little family deepened. Scout was always the first to greet him at the door, bounding toward him with unsteady legs. Rascal learned to bark whenever Daniel laughed, as though joining in. Daisy grew braver, climbing into his lap and pressing her face against his chest with a trust that melted him. Their mother slowly began to let her guard down. One evening, as Daniel sat by the fire reading, She walked up quietly and lay down a few feet from him, her pups nestled against her. It wasn't much, but to Daniel, it felt monumental. "You're starting to believe me, huh?" he whispered, glancing over at her. Her eyes met his, steady but no longer filled with fear. The transformation of his house was undeniable. Once silent, it now pulsed with life and warmth. Friends who stopped by noticed immediately. Karen visited one afternoon, bringing new toys and blankets from the shelter. She sat cross-legged on the floor, laughing as Scout clambered onto her lap and Rascal tugged at her scarf. "They're beautiful," she said softly, watching Daisy curl up against Daniel's leg. "You've given them a second chance." Daniel smiled, shaking his head. "Their mama did that. I just made it easier." Karen's eyes softened as she looked around the room. "I think you needed them just as much as they needed you." At night, when the house was quiet again, Daniel often sat by the fire and thought about Emily. He imagined her smile at the sight of the puppies tumbling over each other, her laughter filling the house again. He pictured her kneeling beside him, helping care for them, stroking their mother's fur until she finally felt safe. Those thoughts were bittersweet, but they no longer hurt in the same way. Instead, they felt like reminders that love could return, even after so much loss. The hardest part was still trust. Mama allowed him closer now, sometimes even lying down in the same room without watching his every move. But the distance lingered. Daniel didn't rush her. He kept feeding her, speaking to her, and sitting nearby without asking more than she could give. Then, one evening, as the snow fell quietly outside, something shifted. He was sitting on the rug, Daisy curled in his lap, when Mama approached slowly. She sniffed his hand, hesitated, then pressed her nose into his palm. Daniel froze, hardly daring to breathe. He let his fingers curl gently, scratching just behind her ear. For the first time, she didn't flinch. Instead, she sighed, closing her eyes for a moment before lying down beside him. Tears burned in Daniel's eyes as he stroked her gently. "You're safe now," he whispered. "I promise. You'll never be hungry or cold again." The puppies stirred, clambering over their mother's back, and for the first time since he had found them in that alley, Daniel felt certain. Their journey wasn't finished, but it had turned a corner. The family had chosen to trust him, and in doing so, they had brought new life into his home, into his heart. It was the beginning of something none of them had expected, but all of them needed. Winter deepened as the weeks passed, but inside Daniel's home, warmth grew in more ways than one. The fireplace glowed nearly every evening, the living room covered in quilts, toys, and the scuff marks of tiny paws. Scout, Rascal, and Daisy were thriving, their puppy energy turning the quiet house into a constant rush of sound and movement. Scout bounded up the stairs one day, managing only half wide before tumbling back down, landing in a heap that had Daniel rushing to scoop him up. Rascal barked at the vacuum cleaner as though it were a fierce intruder, his little body puffed up with determination. Daisy, still gentle and cautious, liked to press against Daniel's side whenever the chaos overwhelmed her. Their antics made Daniel laugh more than he had in years, laughter that filled corners of the house that had been silent far too long. Their mother, still referred to as Mama, continued her slow transformation. Each day, she inched closer to trust. She no longer stiffened when Daniel entered the room, no longer growled at unexpected noises. Sometimes, she even wagged her tail faintly when he came home. The first time he saw that small gesture, Daniel had to swallow hard against the lump in his throat. He knew how much it meant. She had begun lying closer to him in the evenings, stretching out on the rug near his feet, while the puppies tumbled over each other. Her ribs were less pronounced now, her coat shinier, her eyes brighter. Though cautious still, she was healing, piece by piece. Daniel started taking the puppies outside into the yard, bundled in little jackets Karen had brought over. They bounded through the snow, leaving tiny trails of paw prints across the yard. Scout leaped headfirst into a snowdrift and popped out yipping with delight. Rascal barked at every flake as though he could chase them from the sky. Daisy clung close to her mother, stepping carefully, her tiny paws leaving delicate marks. Mama stayed near them, circling protectively, but even she lifted her nose to the cold air, sniffing as though relearning what freedom without fear felt like. Daniel stood on the porch, watching with a smile so wide it hurt his cheeks. Neighbors began to notice the little family too. Children pressed against the fence, giggling as the puppies tumbled near them. One boy shouted, "They're so cute!" while a girl laughed, "That one looks like he's flying." Daniel often waved, letting the kids pet the pups through the fence when Mama stayed calm enough. It warmed him to see others touched by the joy that had taken over his home. One Saturday afternoon, Karen stopped by with more supplies, her arms full of chew toys and treats. She knelt in the living room, laughing, as Scout clambered into her lap and Rascal tugged at her shoelaces. Daisy approached more cautiously, finally settling near her hand. Mama watched carefully from across the room, but her eyes weren't as sharp as they had once been. "They're different dogs than the ones I saw in that alley," Karen said softly, glancing at Daniel. "You've done something amazing here." Daniel shook his head gently, his eyes on Mama. "She did it. I just gave her a chance." Karen smiled knowingly, setting a treat on the rug near Mama. After a long hesitation, Mama crept forward and took it from her hand. The moment left Karen blinking back tears. "She's starting to trust more than just you." The days began to blend into a rhythm. Mornings were filled with feeding, walks in the snowy yard, and cleaning up the chaos of overturned bowls and scattered toys. Afternoons often meant visits to the workshop, where Daniel set up a little pen so the puppies could play while he worked. Scout tried to chew on bits of wood, Rascal barked at every tool, and Daisy curled up in a corner, content to watch. Mama sat nearby, her eyes never leaving them, though sometimes she seemed to study Daniel as he worked, her expression softer than before. Evenings were Daniel's favorite time. The fireplace crackled, the puppies dozed in warm heaps, and Mama lay stretched out with her head resting on her paws. One night, as Daniel sat on the rug stroking Daisy, Mama rose quietly and walked over. She lowered herself beside him, her body pressed close for the first time. Daniel froze, then slowly let his hand rest on her back. Her fur was warm beneath his fingers, her breathing steady. She didn't flinch. Instead, she closed her eyes, leaning slightly into his touch. Daniel felt his throat tighten, his chest swelling with a mixture of relief and joy. "You're really here now," he whispered, his hand gentle as he stroked her. "You're home." From that moment, things began to change even faster. Mama followed him more readily, sometimes padding after him from room to room, her eyes curious instead of guarded. She allowed him to brush her, to check her paws, even to slip a soft collar around her neck. The first time he clipped on a leash, she tensed but didn't pull away. Daniel took her and the puppies for a short walk down the street. the little family trotting along the sidewalk as neighbors turned to smile. It was a sight Daniel never thought he'd see when he first found them shivering in that alley. One evening, as he sat by the fire with Mama resting her head on his knee and the puppies piled in a warm heap beside them, Daniel realized just how far they had all come. His house, once silent and cold, was alive again. The laughter of friends, the barks of puppies, the quiet sigh of a mother who had finally found peace. It filled every corner. He thought of Emily then, of how she would have loved this chaos, and he smiled through the ache. He whispered to the room, as if she might still hear, "We're going to be okay." The journey wasn't over. The puppies still had to grow, Mama still had to learn to trust fully, and Daniel knew there would be challenges ahead. But as the fire glowed and the snow fell gently outside, he felt certain of one thing. They had turned a corner together. Hope had taken root in his home, stronger than the cold, stronger than the fear. It was only the beginning of the life they were building side by side. As winter stretched on, Daniel's home grew busier, brighter, and warmer than it had ever been. Each day began with the patter of small paws and the excited yips of 3 growing puppies, their energy boundless from the moment they woke. Scout darted through the halls, tail wagging like a banner, always the first to greet Daniel at the bedroom door. Rascal barked impatiently until breakfast was served, spinning in small circles on the kitchen floor. Daisy pressed against Daniel's leg as he prepared their meals, her gentle nature making her the quiet anchor of the trio. Their mother, Mama, supervised them with calm but steady vigilance, her eyes following every movement, every noise, ready to intervene if her pups strayed too far. Daniel had adjusted to the new rhythm of life. The silence that once clung to the house like dust was gone, replaced with the happy chaos of feeding schedules, toy squeaks, and tiny growls during playtime. He found himself laughing more than he thought possible, sitting on the floor as 3 puppies wrestled in his lap or tugged at the cuffs of his jeans. Mama often watched from nearby, her gaze still protective, but now tempered with trust. She even allowed Daniel to stroke her fur more often, sometimes resting her head in his lap when the puppies exhausted her with their endless games. Each time she leaned on him, Daniel's chest tightened with gratitude. The puppies grew bolder by the day, eager to explore beyond the confines of the living room. Daniel began letting them into the yard more often, bundled in the jackets Karen had brought. They bounded through the snow like it was their personal playground, leaving trails of tiny paw prints everywhere. Scout discovered the thrill of digging, sending up sprays of snow while Rascal yipped encouragement. Daisy stayed close to Mama at first, but slowly ventured further each time, her cautious paws carrying her into the drifts until her tail wagged with delight. Mama walked among them, sniffing the air, circling protectively, but even she seemed to relax more with every outing. Neighbors stopped often to watch, leaning on fences, smiling at the sight of the little family bounding through the yard. Children laughed as Scout toppled into the snow head first, or when Rascal barked furiously at a snowman. Daniel welcomed the company, letting the children pet the puppies through the fence when Mama seemed calm. The joy of the small family spread outward, touching others in the neighborhood, a ripple of happiness sparked by the dogs that had once huddled in fear and hunger. Inside, the house continued to change. Daniel built a small pen in the corner of the living room, where the puppies could nap safely when he worked, though more often than not, they tumbled onto the rug by the fireplace. He brought Mama into the workshop too, where she lay quietly in the corner, while Scout, Rascal, and Daisy wrestled in a little pen. Daniel found comfort in their presence, their chaos filling spaces that had felt hollow for so long. He even caught himself humming as he worked, a habit he hadn't had since Emily's time. Karen visited often, bringing supplies from the shelter and staying to play with the puppies. She marveled at their growth, her eyes soft as she watched them clamber all over Daniel. "They're a handful," she laughed one afternoon as Rascal tugged at her scarf. Daniel chuckled, scratching Scout behind the ears. "They've taken over my life, and I wouldn't trade it for anything." Karen looked at him for a moment, her expression warm, though she said nothing. One night, as the snow fell softly outside, Daniel sat on the rug by the fire, Mama resting beside him, her head on his knee. The puppies sprawled across his lap in a warm, snoring pile. He stroked Mama's fur gently, marveling at how far they had all come. From the starving, desperate figure in the alley to this, safe, warm, her pups thriving, she was almost unrecognizable. Her ribs no longer showed, her coat gleamed in the firelight, and her eyes held a calm Daniel had never seen before. She shifted slightly, sighing, and Daniel whispered, "You did it. You kept them alive. Now you're safe too." The weeks passed, and with them, small milestones came. The puppies learned to climb onto the couch, bounding across the cushions with squeals of triumph. Daisy finally barked for the first time, a soft but proud sound that made Daniel laugh until tears filled his eyes. Rascal grew louder and bolder, always the first to challenge Mama's patience. Scout remained the leader, clever and adventurous, finding ways to escape the pen or push open doors. Through it all, Mama guided them, correcting their play gently, letting them climb over her, licking them with patience that seemed endless. Dr. Miller saw them again, impressed by their progress. "They're healthy, strong, and well-adjusted," he told Daniel. "You've given them what they needed." Daniel smiled, glancing down at the puppies squirming at his feet. "They've given me more than I ever expected." The vet looked at Mama, who sat calmly by Daniel's side. "And she trusts you now." Daniel reached down, scratching behind her ear as she leaned into his touch. "She's part of the family." As spring began to push against the last grip of winter, the yard thawed, and the puppies discovered grass for the first time. They bounded across it, rolling, tumbling, and barking with delight. Mama trotted after them, tail wagging faintly, her eyes watchful but at ease. Daniel stood on the porch, watching with a smile that stretched wide across his face. His house was no longer quiet, no longer heavy with absence. It was alive, filled with sound, movement, and love. And though the journey wasn't finished, though challenges surely lay ahead, Daniel knew one thing with certainty. They were a family now, bound not by blood, but by survival, trust, and a chance encounter in a cold alley that had changed everything. The first signs of spring came slowly but steadily, melting the last of the snowbanks that had lined the streets all winter. The air felt lighter, carrying the scent of thawing earth, and Daniel opened the windows of his home to let the breeze flow through rooms that had once been so quiet. His house was different now. Where there had once been silence, there was life everywhere. Scout's sharp bark, Rascal's playful growls, Daisy's gentle whines, and Mama's calm, steady presence. The wooden floors bore the scratches of countless paws. The rugs were dotted with toys, and the fireplace was surrounded by blankets where the little family often slept. It was no longer just Daniel's house. It was their home. The puppies had grown quickly, their legs sturdier, their bodies fuller with health. Scout had become adventurous, always the first to dart through an open door into the yard, his tail wagging proudly. Rascal was still the loudest, barking at birds, mail trucks, and shadows alike. Daisy remained gentle, often climbing onto Daniel's lap to curl against him with quiet trust. Mama stayed close to all of them, but her watchful eyes had softened. She trusted Daniel now, fully, often resting her head on his knee in the evenings, sometimes even nudging his hand for affection. When he scratched her ears and she leaned into his touch, he felt the weight of all they had survived together. One morning, Daniel stood in the yard, watching the pups bound across the grass. The world seemed alive with color again. Green shoots pushing up from the ground, birds returning with song. Scout chased Rascal in endless circles, both of them tumbling into the dirt, while Daisy trotted to Daniel, pressing her nose against his palm. Mama lay in the sun, her body stretched out, her eyes half closed in peace. Daniel knelt beside her, stroking her fur gently. "You're safe now," he murmured. "You and them, you're never going to be cold or hungry again." She lifted her head, pressing it briefly into his chest, and Daniel's throat tightened with emotion. Karen stopped by often, her arms full of toys and treats from the shelter, but also just to see the change in the little family. She sat on the porch with Daniel one afternoon, watching as the puppies wrestled in the yard. "They're almost ready," she said softly. Daniel frowned, glancing at her. "Ready for what?" Karen tilted her head toward the pups. "For homes. Families who can love them like you do." The thought sat heavy in Daniel's chest. He looked at Scout leaping through the grass, at Rascal barking with his whole body, at Daisy pressed close to Mama. The idea of letting them go made his heart ache. "I don't know if I can," he admitted. Karen smiled gently. "Sometimes the hardest part of rescuing is knowing when to let go. But you'll know what's right for them." That night, Daniel sat by the fire, the puppies curled against him, Mama at his feet. He thought of what Karen had said. It was true that many people would love to adopt them, to give them homes full of care. But as Daisy sighed against his chest and Rascal yipped in his dreams, Daniel realized something. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't just a rescue. They were his family now. He whispered it aloud, the words steady in the quiet room. "You're home. All of you." Mama's ears twitched at his voice and she shifted closer, as though she understood. The decision felt right, and once it was made, peace settled over him. Over the next weeks, life grew into a beautiful rhythm. Mornings in the yard, afternoons in the workshop, evenings by the fire. Scout grew clever, learning to open the gate latch until Daniel had to secure it better. Rascal developed a habit of dragging Daniel's boots into the living room, barking proudly as if he had caught prey. Daisy learned to curl at Daniel's feet whenever he read, her quiet loyalty making her his constant shadow. Mama found her place too, no longer just a protector, but a companion, lying beside Daniel during long evenings, padding after him from room to room. Neighbors who once only waved now stopped to talk, drawn by the joy radiating from the house. Children leaned on the fence, laughing as the puppies bounded up to greet them. One neighbor, an older man named Frank, shook his head with a smile. "Never thought I'd see this house so alive again," he said. Daniel nodded, glancing down at Daisy nestled against his leg. "Neither did I." Spring blossomed into summer, and with it came new milestones. The puppies learned to swim in a shallow creek near the woods, splashing through the water with joyful abandon. Scout, always the leader, leapt in first, Rascal barking furiously before tumbling after, and Daisy dipping her paws with caution until Mama stepped in beside her. Daniel stood at the bank, laughing so hard tears filled his eyes. The sight of them alive, free, and happy was more than he had ever dared to hope for when he first found them huddled in the alley. Mama's transformation was perhaps the most remarkable of all. She gained weight, her coat shone, and her eyes no longer carried the shadows of fear. She ran now, bounding through the yard with her puppies, sometimes even playing tug-of-war with Scout. She followed Daniel with quiet devotion, her trust no longer hesitant but complete. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in orange and pink, she placed her head in his lap and looked up at him with eyes that held gratitude, peace, and love. Daniel stroked her gently, whispering, "You did it. You gave them life. And you gave me mine back too." The days stretched on, each one filled with joy. The house was never silent now, never lonely. Laughter, barking, and the sound of paws running across the floor filled every corner. The pain of the past had softened, replaced with a family Daniel hadn't known he needed. He often thought of Emily, of how she would have loved this chaos, and he felt certain she was smiling somewhere, glad that he had found his way to this moment. By the end of summer, the puppies were nearly grown, their legs long, their bodies strong. They raced through the fields, leapt through the creek, barked at the wind. Mama ran with them, her body sleek and powerful, her eyes bright. Daniel stood at the porch, watching as they bounded back toward him, their tails wagging, their joy uncontainable. When they reached him, they piled against his legs, barking, licking, pressing close. Mama sat beside him, her body leaning against his. Daniel looked out at the horizon, the golden light spilling across the yard, and felt something he hadn't in years: complete. Their journey had begun in a cold alley, born of hunger and fear, but it had led them here, to warmth, safety, and love. They were no longer just survivors. They were family. Daniel bent down, wrapping his arms around Mama's neck, the puppies bouncing around them. His voice was thick with emotion as he whispered, "We made it. Together." And in that moment, surrounded by the family he had never expected, Daniel knew their story had found its ending, not in loss or fear, but in the unshakable bond of love and the promise of a future they would share, side by side.